Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick. I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture, A Millennial's Take on Emerging Higher Education Policy Issues in the 21st Century. It'll be presented by Zakiya Smith. With her degrees from Vanderbilt University and Harvard Graduate School of Education, Ms. Smith quickly emerged as a rising star in higher education policy. She served from 2009 to 2012 in senior policy advising roles in the Obama administration, first at the U.S. Department of Education and later at the White House's Domestic Policy Council. It was in the latter capacity that she helped develop the ideas around college cost and value that figured prominently in the President's 2012 State of the Union address. When asked recently about her career goals, Ms. Smith replied, "My career goal is to improve people's lives through education. That's it." After leaving the White House, she found her way in 2013 to the Lumina Foundation, the largest private foundation in the country focused solely on improving higher education attainment. In her present position as strategy director, Ms. Smith helps to develop new models of student financial support for higher education. In his inauguration address a year ago, President Hanlon issued a call to action for us at Dartmouth to build our academic enterprise around 4 themes, one of which was affordability. While affordability is relevant at Dartmouth, private institutions like Dartmouth educate a small percentage of today's college students and an even smaller percentage of those for whom a college education is the only ticket into the middle class. Those students are educated in our public universities, where there has been a dramatic shift in educational finance over the past 25 years. Put very briefly, over that time period, the share of costs paid by students at public universities has doubled from about 25 to 50%, with the share provided by state appropriations falling from 75 to 50%. According to Professor Susan Dynarski of the University of Michigan, the explanation for rising tuition prices isn't spiraling costs. The costs are the same, but the burden of paying those costs has shifted from state taxpayers to students. Many students have been taking on debt to finance this increase in their share of higher education costs. In theory, this could lead to better choices, as students should only be taking on this debt if the return to college is high enough to make it worth it to do so. But figuring out if a college is worth it is no simple task. When we talk about the return to a college education, we may have in mind a student who takes on the debt, gets the degree, gets the better job for which that degree provides the credential, and pays off the debt with a portion of the extra earnings between the better job and the job that she would have gotten with the lesser credentials. That's the way it's supposed to work. But what if she takes on the debt but doesn't get the degree? Now she has the lesser job and the expenses of paying off the debt. Or what if she takes on the debt and gets the degree, but the better job doesn't materialize, perhaps because she had the misfortune of graduating into a very weak labor market? The average borrower now graduates with more than $26,000 of debt, loan default rates are rising, and only about half of those who start college get their degree within 6 years. The policy response to this state of affairs has been to try to provide measures of so-called accountability for colleges and universities, with the sometimes stated goal of then directing a greater share of the roughly $150 billion in annual federal financial aid toward those institutions that score highest according to these accountability measures. We are very fortunate to have Ms. Smith here today to give her expertise as a designer of some of those measures and a well-positioned observer of others. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Zakiya Smith.
All right, so I have this microphone here, and I think you can hear me, and I'm going to try to be engaging and talk with you like this, and hopefully that works because you're young and I'm supposedly young, and so those things are supposed to work together. I want to thank you all for having me here. This is like a real Ivy League college. I kind of sort of went to one, but that was, in a big city and, with lots of other things around. But this is like, you're here, and it's very, very intense. So I'm slightly intimidated by the level of expertise of the people in the room versus me, but I hope I have something useful to add. I label this talk a millennial's take on 21st century higher education issues. I think that's what I labeled the talk when they asked me a little while ago. And hoping to talk about some of the things that are going on with colleges. Andrew just did a great job of kind of going through some of the biggest issues that we're thinking about right now: affordability, whether or not people complete student loan debt. And so those are the things that I actually want to talk about today. I want to talk about affordability. I want to talk about college completion. And I actually want to talk about quality. I think all of those things are related, and hopefully engage in some good Q&A afterwards once we think about those things. Before I start getting into all of that, though, I think it's helpful to kind of share what my biases are up front, because when we talk about challenges, it presumes that we're all working from the same notion of what the goals of higher education are. And that's not always true, or what the goals of policy are, or what we should be looking for higher education to do differently. My bias, I work for Lumina Foundation. That doesn't have to necessarily play into my bias, but I will say that it does, where our goal is that by 2025, 60% of the American population or adult population has some form of post-secondary degree or credential. Post-secondary meaning anything after high school, including an associate's degree, a certificate, or a bachelor's degree. So not just the kind of does everybody need to get a four-year college degree question. But that does presume that more people should be going to college than are currently going, and that more people need to complete college than are currently completing college. And those are both assumptions with which you may not agree. Some people disagree with the notion that more people should be going to and finishing some sort of post-secondary education. I generally think it would be a good thing if we had more people to do that. There are kind of economists don't always agree with one another, but the economists that I like suggest that the nature of the job market is changing, and that the types of jobs that are being created require higher levels of education than the ones of the past generation. My father grew up in Akron, Ohio, where the best thing to do to become a good member of society and have a great middle-class job was to go work in the tire factories. Goodwill was there, Firestone was there. I think they probably still have a few offices, but most of the actual jobs are elsewhere right now. And when he decided he wanted to go to college, mostly because he wanted to get away from the smell of burning rubber. I don't know if anyone had ever been to Akron, Ohio in like 1965, but it was not a pleasant place. You would know it when you got there, because you could smell it. He wanted to go to college, and everybody thought that was a dumb idea, because the best way to get a good job was to get a good factory job and to stay with that forever, and you could buy yourself a nice American-made car, and your life would be wonderful. And Akron, Ohio, I think it's going through a resurgence now, but for a long time was part of the Rust Belt that kind of saw jobs go overseas. And if you didn't have a higher education, it was really hard to navigate that environment. So the nature of kind of American economy right now, some people suggest that the types of jobs that are being created are those that require higher levels of functioning, and that people will not stay in one job for the rest of their career, but they're going to move around, and that requires you to be able to navigate things in a different way. Again, people disagree with that assessment, but that's the one that I'm working under. More people should go to college so that they have these higher level skills so that they can kind of move around, and the jobs that are being created are those that require higher levels of education than has been the case in the past. With that said, I'm also a nerd, so I said I would, saying what this talk was about, I said I was going to talk a little bit about myself, and I think it's helpful to, kind of understanding where I'm coming from when I talk about affordability, quality, and completion. So I've always been interested in education, always, for the most part. Since I was a child, I was a really, really weird, precocious child, and I had copies of U.S. News and World Report in my bedroom when I was like in 6th grade, and I was looking at them ever since then. I was always interested in becoming a teacher. I first wanted to become an astronaut. I think everybody wanted to become an astronaut, and then I realized that we would go to the NASA Space Center in Alabama. I'm from Atlanta, so it's not that far away. We would always take field trips to the Space Center, and finally they said, oh yeah, the best preparation for astronauts, if you're really physically fit, and you should go to the military. There's a lot of people, oh my God, not going to be an astronaut anymore, don't want to do any type of strenuous physical activity, and said that I would work instead here at command, or when they say Houston, we have a problem, I said I would be Houston, and I decided I instead wanted to be an astrophysicist. And I wasn't actually sure if the astrophysicists were the people in the command center, but that sounded really, really cool. It sounded like I would get to work with things and do experiments and do science, and I really liked that. At some point, I had really bad math teachers. And what we now know is if you had 2 bad teachers in a row, it kind of ruins your life in this specific area. And so I had a really bad trigonometry teacher, and if he watches this, you were really, really bad. And we didn't really learn a whole lot. And then that didn't prepare, but I still got an A in the class because that's what happens in American high school sometimes, and went to the next class, which was like pre-calculus, and not only was the teacher really bad, I didn't like her, we didn't learn a whole lot. She actually ended up getting fired, which was really difficult to do prior to the current regimes of education policy. So it was really hard to be fired as a public school teacher. She ended up getting fired. So really bad math teachers, 2 in a row. And I decided instead that I didn't want to be an astrophysicist anymore, but I really wanted to go into teaching because it can have such a profound impact on students' lives. And that, that was something I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed helping my classmates. I thought I was pretty smart. I thought it was dumb that we had this culture that if you were smart, you went and did something else, and if you weren't so smart, that you would go and do education, which was kind of the perception, and that still exists in some circles. And I thought, if you're really smart, you should teach. You should teach other people, because that's the way that we kind of get better educated people, is the smartest people should be teachers. So anyway, I thought I was smart, and I wanted to be a teacher. And I still hope that I think I'm smart, and I still think of myself as teaching in a lot of ways in my various jobs. But when I was in high school, I also realized that there was a lot of stuff around the education system that didn't have anything to do with what the classroom teacher decided. So there was a lot of stuff that determined how well students learned or how they progressed through the system that wasn't really the teacher's own doing. And that there was this whole kind of environment around the teaching experience called policy. The education policy kind of determined what time school started. And whether it's to start earlier or later, and where I even got to go to school. Should I go to this school or should I go to the other school down the street? And who were the teachers within my school? What textbooks did we use? What classes did we have to take? All of those things were not decided by the teacher, but were part of my school experience and a large part of it. And I realized that there was this whole environment of education policy. And so my high school self started reading up on education policy and standards-based reform. And at the time, you've heard part of my bio, which sounded really good when you were reading it. So I graduated from high school in 2002, which was right after No Child Left Behind was passed. So I was like, this is a really huge thing in education policy. And I printed it out on my dad's kind of laser printer at home, and I read this, or I tried to read the whole thing, and I was like, this is really complicated, but it really seems interesting. And I don't just want to be a teacher, but I want to go into education policy. So that was me in high school. I'm a super nerd, and I went to college with the idea that I wanted to go into education policy. So I've been interested in this kind of stuff for some time, and that's kind of the background of why I'm involved in this stuff now. My high school was a very weird place. There are not many places like it. I grew up in suburban Atlanta, but there's a really large, black middle class, upper middle class, even black people, and that's something that I didn't realize until I went to college is not normal if you're a middle-class black person to grow up with a whole bunch of other black people that are also middle class. It is not unusual for most people that are in upper middle-class neighborhoods to grow up in racially homogenous neighborhoods. It is unusual if you're an African-American person for that to be the case. So, but I also saw kind of achievement issues even within our neighborhood. So it was common for everybody to go to college. It was very much, your parents went to college, you should go to college. They have professional jobs, you should have professional jobs. But there were still kind of issues, and there were still differences in terms of where people went and what they knew about. And I realized that was something I wanted to explore a little bit more when I went to school. So fast forward, I went to Vanderbilt University, did what I said I would do, majored in education, got my teaching certification, was still interested in this policy thing, so I double majored in political science because I thought that would help me learn policy. Vanderbilt was a great place. I really enjoyed it, but yeah. So I ended up having an internship in D.C. on Capitol Hill, and that was where I actually learned how policy is really made. It was a fascinating experience, and I felt like I learned more in my summer there than I did at my 4 years at Vanderbilt, even though I felt like I learned a lot at Vanderbilt. What I saw there in D.C. was just this amazing energy and young people everywhere. And so on the first point was like, wow, this is where the power is. It feels like The West Wing, which was kind of my thing at that time. You know, House of Cards it was much more inspiring than House of Cards. The West Wing was. So I thought, you know, this is where I've got to be. You know, when I come back from graduate school, because you had to go to graduate school, because if anybody knows about teaching, my mom said, if you just go become a teacher and you don't get your master's degree, you'll never get the salary bump that comes with getting a master's degree at teaching. So I immediately, you know, enrolled in graduate school right after undergrad because I had to get my master's degree, because that's what you do when you want to be a teacher, is you get your master's degree so you can have a salary bump, so that you don't go teach somewhere, get married, have kids, and never go back to school. So anyway, I did that. Didn't get married and have kids, but I did go get my master's degree, had the internship in DC, and my life was kind of really changed. I just thought, this is where I've got to be. There's so much energy here. Young people are doing everything, which may be part of the reason why DC is the way it is, because young people are behind all of that stuff that's happening. Members of Congress, I had this image in my head in my political science classes of debates going on Capitol Hill, and they're studying all of these different issues in lots of earnest intent, and these, you know, really important people are studying the different, you know, issues that they're debating on the floor of the House of Representatives, and then it goes to committees where they study and debate it some more. And then I got there for my internship and realized that everyone just gets emailed the vote for the day and how you're supposed to vote if you're a Republican or a Democrat. If you're a Democrat and you know, say you're not going to vote, or if you're in either party and you say you're not going to vote the way the leadership of the party says that you should vote, then you're supposed to call them immediately, or your money for your fundraising will get shut down. So that is the way policy is made in DC. Not entirely, but it's not as kind of robust as what I thought. But I did realize that there were a lot of people there who had a lot of power. There were people in party leadership, there were these committees that decided things, and I just wanted to come back. And I saw people doing these jobs, they were legislative assistants and things like that, and I felt like they were really kind of making things happen, and they didn't know anything more than I did, so if they could do it, I could do it, and I should come back. So went to grad school, was really interested in, I studied at Harvard School of Education, where there was a professor there that focused on financial aid and how it could impact college access and getting more students to go to college. Her name is Bridget Terry Long, and she is a labor economist and looks at kind of these issues. And so it was fascinating to me. It's like, wow, there's specific kind of ways that federal policy could get more people to go to college. And I'm interested in, you know, policy. I'm interested in DC. I'm also interested in more people going to college. I'm interested in this kind of policy environment. This is really interesting. This is new. And so I came out of graduate school intending to come back to DC and work on that issue. And I worked at this place called the Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance, which works on different projects to inform Congress and the Secretary of Education on ways to make college more accessible. So that is kind of how I got to DC. I worked at the White House and in the Obama administration in a very weird way, which is the DC way, which is it's who you know. So one of the members of that committee that I worked on staff for previously worked in the Clinton administration and had he got a position in the Obama administration. Tends to be the way it works. You know somebody, kind of part of the party. And he came there to work for a short stint of time. He was supposed to be there for like 2 or 3 weeks until they could hire more people. And I want you to go back with me to 2009 and the beginning of the Obama administration, before lots of things happened, but we're in the middle of the worst recession our country has ever seen. Everyone is legitimately freaking out. We've got our first black president, and that's really nice, but at the same time, the economy is literally falling out. People are saying we're gonna have another Great Depression unless they do something. And everyone is really, really scared. Now they're worried that they elected this guy. Does he know what he's doing? He needs to fill a cabinet. They need to hire people to work in the Department of Education. The Department of Education was probably like one of the least areas of concern, but you know, we had Arne Duncan, who was one of the first cabinet secretaries appointed, and they were debating the stimulus. And at this time, the stimulus funding, the American Recovery Act, had money to all these different sectors and to different states to help stimulate the economy. That was the idea. A large part of that was education funding. And so Arne and his team, which didn't really consist of that many people at the time, was trying to think about how Congress should structure the stimulus funding to be the best it could be for education. And this guy that had been in the Clinton administration named Bob Shireman was picked to help Arne Duncan think about higher education. And Bob knew me because I worked on this committee I was staffing this committee, and he asked me to help. And he asked me to help because I had a Department of Education ID, I didn't need a security clearance because I already had one, and I think he figured I was a Democrat because of, I don't know, stuff. So he said, could you come and like help me out? And it was like, he was like, this job it's really being my assistant, and I'm really sorry because I know that this is like, you're way overqualified for this. You have a master's degree, whatever, but I just need somebody to like help schedule my meetings. No one works here yet. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm like kind of sort of tangentially helping Barack Obama, and I would do anything for Barack Obama. I would sweep the floors if they asked me to sweep the floors. So of course I'll be your assistant. So I left my job at this committee. I went to be his assistant. I was literally scheduling his meetings, but I also did some other things. Teach you a little bit about humility and what you're willing to do if you want to get in the right places. But I knew him. He got me there, and instead of just staying for a couple of weeks, I ended up staying for 2.5 years. He ended up staying for a year and a half. I didn't hire, but they hired other people to do various different things. And at the time, one of the biggest challenges was this affordability challenge. So now I'm actually getting into what do we know about, what are the biggest challenges with affordability, quality, completion. One of the things that is was a big deal at the time was the thinking about the economy. And this kind of rationale that I just espoused, the idea that the economy is changing and the people who are getting jobs now are those who have college degrees, was part of the narrative of the economic recovery. So it was like, yes, we need to create jobs, but we also need to create a better educated workforce so that when people lose jobs and when jobs come back, the jobs that come back tend to be those that are higher skill level. So higher education was thrust into the forefront. The president had this goal. He said that we needed to be first in the world with the proportion of our adults that have jobs and have college degrees, and that our colleges aren't doing a good enough job helping people complete. And that is the graduation rate for nationally. Like if you look at people who start at four-year colleges, actually 6 years later, 59% didn't graduate. That's not really what we think of when we think of like as a really good graduation rate. With our high schools, we have 75% graduation rate and people are really, really freaking out. So we have what I would consider to be a college completion problem. A lot of people who start college do not finish. If you look at community colleges, it's even worse. And what we think of when we think of college is probably not what really exists in most of American society when people go to college. The average, so residential campus, four-year college, first time going to college, all of those characteristics of what we think, you're leaving high school, you're going to college, you're going to stay on campus, that represents 19% of students in higher education today. So that's, there's 42% of students are enrolled in community colleges. A vast majority, or not vast majority, a lot of students work while they're in school, part-time or full-time. So there's an older population, like 40% or something like that are independent, meaning they're over the age of 24, they are married, they have dependents of their own, or have served in the military. So these people are more and more who's going to college today, and their college experience looks very different than what we think of when we think of college. And those people are dealing with affordability struggles that are very different than what students at Dartmouth may be dealing with, or even students at the University of Michigan or things like that. So when we think about what does it mean to complete college and why aren't people completing, that completion rate is looking at that population of students. They're not living on campus, they're working, they got kids to take care of. And the problems of higher education need to be thinking about those types of students. So college completion is a really big problem, and it's a bigger problem because of student debt. And over time, we've used student loans to finance higher education more and more than we had in the past. More students borrow than ever before. You could call it a crisis, but probably not for the reasons you think. Another statistic that I always find interesting is that the average amount of debt that's in default, like the average balance of debt that's in default on student loans, is lower than the average amount that's in good standing. So you would think that people are defaulting on the really high amounts of debt, that people that are really, really, just buried in lots and lots of debt are the ones that are defaulting, but that's not what we're seeing. We're actually seeing people defaulting on relatively small, what we think of, small amounts of money. So you have people who probably didn't finish their programs, therefore did not get the benefit of going to college, defaulting on their student loans. And it may have just been from one semester, 1 year, at a public college, at a community college, but they're still defaulting because they don't have the income that comes from having the job that supports the higher wages. So that's something that the debt, the affordability issue, is not just a issue that's disconnected to the completion issue. It's very much related. The last thing is quality, and I bring in quality because I think it's really difficult to talk about affordability without talking about what you're buying. What are you getting for your money? Comparisons, there's really few things on this earth like college. So I am loath to make comparisons, but for simplicity's sake, I will make a comparison in the simplest way possible, which is using a hamburger. So if I go to McDonald's and get a hamburger, I should expect to get it for less than $5. And if McDonald's increased the prices of hamburgers tomorrow to $10, I guarantee you there'd be a national outcry. I'd be like, what does McDonald's think they're doing selling these ridiculously, expensive hamburgers? No one cares that the hamburger at the inn, the Dartmouth Inn or the Hanover Inn, is like $15. I hear it's the best hamburger in town. And I thought it was like a great deal at $15. But that's because people perceive the quality of the hamburger at the Dartmouth Inn to be greater than the quality of the hamburger at McDonald's. And so when we think about affordability, sometimes you could think about it as whether people literally have the money in their pockets to pay or whether they can borrow enough to pay. But there's this other aspect of what are people willing to pay for? And what they're willing to pay Dartmouth for may be different than what they're willing to pay the University of Southern New Hampshire for, or what they're willing to pay at Georgia State University, or what they're willing to pay the University of Phoenix. And it should be. There should be differences based on what you perceive the quality to be. Problem is, the way we perceive quality in the United States higher education is based on how long you've been around and what your prestige is. And sometimes that's a good way to view quality. But sometimes, particularly if your family hasn't been to college before, you may think a college is a college is a college is a college is a college. And that is a really squishy world. And I actually do not have the answer of how we should determine what quality is in higher education. But I think that is really integral to the question of affordability and how we deal with it as we move into the 21st century. So I think my talk was just supposed to be about emerging issues, and I've laid them out without giving any solutions. So I think I'm done. You can clap now, or you could ask questions, or whatever you would like to do. So I'm supposed to take questions, and yes, you have one.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So, where do you think vocational education plays a part in forming these kinds of policy decisions?
I think that's a really good question. So vocational or career and technical education, that kind of thing, are all part of the post-secondary landscape. The emerging kind of trend is that they should be stackable credentials. So especially for folks that are adults, and it tends to be the experience that adults who are going to college or some type of post-secondary education have a little bit more in mind of what they hope to get out of it than 18 or 17-year-olds. Because they've been in the workplace, they've seen what not having a credential can do, and they're very clear on their goals. And sometimes that goal is to get a certificate as X. It's to get, I really, really wanted to be an auto mechanic, but the best jobs require a certificate in this state and requires this certification. I want to be a nurse practitioner, but I can't get there because I don't have this credential. So vocational, and those are both kind of vocational degrees, and I think they have a real good place in this landscape. But as I mentioned, the nature of things is changing, and so what you don't want to do is put somebody in a dead-end place. You would like for that to be something that they could then layer. So maybe I'm a nurse practitioner, then become an RN, and then I get, the next level thing. That's a really easy example because there are stackable levels of nursing. But the idea generally is that those vocational degrees don't become a dead end, because what we've tended to do with career and technical education is track people in there, and then they're there and they are looking for a way up to the next thing, and it's not really easy to articulate. So to transfer those credits into something else. So maybe you have a certificate, you want to get an associate's degree. You have an associate's degree, you want to get a bachelor's degree. So those things should be stackable so that as you progress along your career, if you want to get more education, hopefully get more money, that you could do it. Yes?
So do you think it's just a natural progression of the U.S. economy, or do you think just a societal push towards higher education is actually helping to replace the tire factory jobs with service jobs?
I don't think I'm going to say something that people probably don't usually say, but I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question. But I will give a response because that doesn't stop people who are in positions of whatever from answering questions. And I learned early on during my college career that the way you get ahead is by acting with confidence, even if you don't know what you're talking about. So and it's helped me in DC quite a lot. I don't think that higher education is the reason the economy is changing. I think higher education can be a way to kind of respond to the economy is changing, but I don't think that because we're asking more people to get degrees that these jobs are then going overseas or whatever. I think that the jobs are going overseas, and now we're saying our education system should kind of match what's happening there. Yeah.
When you talk about accessibility and affordability, I kind of see there as being two issues. There's one on kind of the school's part to make themselves accessible, and then there's also a kind of community, more local community and social aspect to it. So how do you see what needs to change in certain communities where it's not necessarily expected that you go to college or accepted? How do you change perceptions of college and a college education?
So I think that's a really good question, because part of the reason, one of the best answers to the question of why college is so expensive is because it can be. And that is probably the easiest answer that I've ever heard. If in a general economy, if people didn't pay for something, then it would shut down or the price would change. And for a variety of reasons, through access to credit, home equity lines of credit, student loans, et cetera, people are able to pay different college prices. They might be putting it on their credit cards. Some people, very few people, but maybe a lot of people at Dartmouth actually their families have the money to actually pay the prices without those types of things. And that does allow the system to grow at whatever pace it would be. If it were the case that people couldn't pay that and all they had were $5, then you'd have $5 colleges, because that'd be all people have the money to afford if there weren't enough people that could pay. So I think part of it is educating people that they're not necessarily, that every place, that you could get good quality from less expensive places, and you can. Most people don't go to private colleges, as we talked about. Most people go to public colleges, but there's still kind of a perception that you get a certain level of quality, and I think there's a lot of murky middle in American higher education. So I don't know how to tell you whether Georgia State is better than Georgia Southern. I don't know whether how to tell you whether you should be willing to pay more to go to University of Florida out of state, or whether you should just go to University of Georgia. I can't, I don't, and that's kind of the decisions that people are trying to make. But you can spend a lot less if you go in-state, right, into the place there. But for whatever reason, maybe it's, you like the campus somewhere, but if I don't have kids, so I can say this, but if I had kids and if it was going to cost me $20,000 more because they like the campus of this place versus another place, unless that campus had significant crime and whatever, I might think twice about whether that's a good enough reason to send them somewhere else if I thought everything else was equal. Right? So the notion of, part of it is the notion of, I have my dream school and I just really, really have to go there. And if this was anyone's dream school, I'm sure it really was. I'm very glad that you're here. Vanderbilt was not my dream school, but they did give me a full scholarship. And I'm very happy I went. And I'm looking back 15 years. My parents had told me that if I had I wanted to go to Duke. I really wanted to go to Duke. I got into Duke. Duke didn't really give me that much money. They gapped me, which meant that the financial aid package that they gave me told me that my family needed to pay $25,000 a year. I came from a fairly middle-class family, but $25,000 a year was more money than the government said that they had, and more money than they felt like they had, and more money, most importantly, more money than they were willing to pay per year. But what they did tell me was that as my first adult decision, I could decide whether I personally, Zakiya Smith, not my family, would like to take on that money in a private student loan for my own debt, which would mean that if I graduated in 4 years, I'd have $100,000 in student loans for that wonderful place. And I decided that Vanderbilt was a really fine college and that it wasn't worth the difference of $100,000. The world may never know if I would have been an astrophysicist had I gone to Duke and been, adding so much more to society. But I think your point is well taken, that we need better information for people to help them navigate the choices. But there's also a responsibility of colleges to think about, especially public colleges, where, as we heard, the issue is not so much just how much they're charging, but how much they're charging in relation to how much they're getting from the states, so how much their state legislatures are giving them in terms of appropriations. And so encouraging states to kind of fund their public colleges at a reasonable level, I think, is good. But there's also a lot of competition between what I will call the elite publics and the privates, and UCLA wants to be Stanford and that kind of thing. Yes.
Thank you. What are your feelings on this new push towards online universities and how that's influencing the quality and like how it's especially influencing that group of students who are older and have families and whatnot?
I'm always interested in actually students like you and your perception of, online colleges. I imagine that, I don't know. I'll save that for I'll answer first and then I'll ask you again. So people are going to college online. A lot of people are going to college online ever since the internet was created and has, gotten proliferated through more American households. People have access to it. People are going to college online at increasing rates. A lot of people are doing what is technically known as blended learning, where some of their classes are online, especially at community colleges. Some of the classes will be online, some of them will be in person, so they're not getting a totally online experience. Some people may pick up a course here or there. If you were somewhere that you just needed an extra class, or my sister was at Georgia Tech, and she did take some classes online because it's Georgia Tech, and that's what they do, and they don't really care. But in any case, she could have taken a class like at the community college online to like fulfill a requirement or something like that, but her experience wasn't wholly online. So I think it's happening, and there are many places where the quality has been determined to be just as high. People, from what we can measure, students score just as well on the tests in the online format as they do in person. One thing, in some cases, one thing that we've seen though is that the online format tends not to work well for younger students and for students that have kind of not learning disabilities, but well, yes, learning disabilities. It also need remedial coursework. So if you're not like, your whole life you haven't been the most motivated go-getter, you're not like a self-paced student or whatever, which often tends to be the case if it's your first time in college and you kind of need the group, or you might need a phone call to remember to go to class. If you need a phone call to remember to go to class, you're less likely to like log on and do all of their work that comes along with online learning. So I think there are different populations, and the older adult population, if they don't need significant like extra help, if they don't need a tutor to help them through these different things, if they don't need the motivation to keep taking the classes, it can be useful, but I don't think it's the panacea that's going to change the way everything is done. I think it's going to happen because more and more things are done online. So it'll become more and more of a part of higher education, but I don't think that online universities are going to wholly replace the entire way we do college. Would you like to go to college online?
I would not, just because I think I grew up in a family where it was normal to go to 4-year college. But a lot of my friends who have decided to take a community college route or decided to go to a big state school will probably take classes online while they're there, and they'll kind of do a blended learning. Same with my friends who were athletes or had some sort of other more like alternative career goal where they'll do a lot of supplements online or take stuff over the summer because they just don't offer the class they need.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that'll be, you'll see more of that. Yes.
I wanted to ask your opinion about community colleges and the sort of role they're playing in all of this for both the affordability, but then also the quality and completion. And I just, so I teach here at Dartmouth, but I've been involved with a program where we're working with some of the community colleges in New Hampshire, and and I didn't go to a community college either, and so, some of the differences that we call what we do here college and we call what we do there, they do there college, is striking. Not, maybe most importantly, that they are so under-resourced to provide even basic classroom experiences and things. And so, to me, I think, and I don't know a lot about this policy issue, but we've been expanding community college as the way to help more people get access. But it really makes me then think about the role of the community colleges in ultimately completion, and then also on, yes, it's much lower cost, much lower price than what you're going to pay at Dartmouth or even UNH or another state university. But if you're not going to get the job coming out and you still took on debt, is it worth the price?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a real crisis in community colleges with completion. So even with whatever the standards are, there are a lot of students who don't finish, which is expected in an open access environment. People, talk about MOOCs, these like online classes and stuff. And then people talked about no one's completing the MOOCs. They have really low completion rates. Well, I started a MOOC and I didn't finish it because I was working at the White House, and I thought it would be cool to like take another econ class, but it's not. It's not fun to take another econ class in your spare time when you're working at the White House. So I didn't finish it, and it doesn't matter because I already have a college degree, and we shouldn't be concerned about my non-completion. But community colleges have kind of a similar issue with a lot of people who don't have any. There was no real barrier to entry except for having a GED or a high school diploma. But they also have a serious issue with quality and transfer. And what we do know is if you want to get a bachelor's degree, like if you know that you want to get a bachelor's degree, it is really better to start at a four-year institution because the rates, not just because the rates of transfer are low, but for whatever reason, when you start at a four-year institution, you're more likely to complete than when you start at a community college. You're more likely to complete a four-year degree, which seems to make sense to me, like, just the barrier of having to articulate the classes or whatever can be a pain, and that doesn't always work out. I think some states do community colleges much better than others, as with everything. We have a federal system, so there's all these different states. California historically has at least tried to have a system that makes sense in terms of if you do 2 years at the community colleges, you could transfer to a UC or CSU. That's part of their mission. They accept large classes of transfer students each year, et cetera. It was built that way. Now, in recent years, there have been capacity issues, there have been funding issues with the community colleges, and there's been concerns that they haven't been working as they originally were planned. But a lot of places didn't even have that as the initial plan. I worry a lot about us. I think community colleges are wonderful, and they should, prior to community colleges existing, and in other countries, the notion that you could just go to college without any kind of special stuff, like that there's a place in your community that's drivable that you could go to and learn stuff just doesn't exist. That doesn't exist in other countries, this kind of open access thing that we have, so I think it's great. But I do think we have to consider whether that's the best route for trying to make sure that low-income students have access because of the issue that I just mentioned. So in addition to all of the sociological kind of effects of not having your same first 2 years and being apart from other people or whatever, and there being a stigma attached and all of that, we just know that if you want to get a bachelor's degree, that it's really impeded if you don't start there. And even within four-year colleges, there's a real epidemic. This is also contested, but I'm up here, so whatever, talk about it. The epidemic of students who are not going to the college that is most, the term is undermatching, but I don't, but students who could go to a more selective college than what they decided to go to. So they maybe were accepted to two schools, or they look like on paper that they have the academic qualifications to go to a more selective institution. What we know is that in general, if you could go to a more selective institution, if you're low income or whatever, that you actually have higher rates of completion than if you went to a less selective one, which seems odd because it seems like, if it's less selective, it should be easier and you should finish. But it seems like maybe there's something about the expectation or the culture of kind of success around you that makes it more likely that you're actually able to graduate if you're at a place that's higher selective. So there's kind of a lot of talk, particularly around the affirmative action stuff, of people overmatching and feeling overwhelmed and whatever. And it's interesting because feeling overwhelmed when you're in college should be a naturally good thing to happen. Like if you're not coming to college and feeling like it's challenging, that's probably not good. It should be challenging. But there's much more of a concern about people who are going to colleges and that don't realize that they could be going to, I hate to use these kind of normative terms, but better colleges. And it better for whatever reason. Better because they have more resources, better because they have more writing coaches, better because they have better faculty, better because they have more caring individuals, better for whatever reason, they're more likely to graduate if they went to these other colleges that also happen to be more selective. We know that, and I'll send this, or I'll figure out a way, but basically years and years of research suggest that rich, less not less intelligent because they're multiple intelligent, but rich kids with lower SAT scores and lower GPAs go to college at higher rates than poor kids with the highest SAT scores and highest grades. So that suggests to me that there's like something not right with, they graduate from college at lower rates. So the lower income kids. So there's something wrong with like our meritocracy if that's going on. And I think part of the community colleges need to be improved, but we've got to think of them as something other than where you go if you don't have the money. Yes.
Zakiya, when you talked to my class this morning,
Yes.
we talked about the Lumina Foundation.
Yes.
And you explained to them that Lumina, well-endowed foundation, spends a lot of money providing grants and so forth for researchers to deal with some of these problems. What are the two or three or four main policy recommendations that Lumina is now behind that would help us get to the 60% or better goal?
So a couple of things that Lumina has been behind. We've been pushing for states to have performance-based funding of their colleges rather than enrollment-based funding. So public colleges and states are usually given money based on the number of students they enroll, and we think that if we care about them completing more students, we should shift more of that to be based on the number of students that actually graduate. So that's one. That's somewhat controversial. It's not without controversy for sure, and it has some potential, unintended consequences. Another that where I'm pushing is to think about subsidies to higher education and subsidies to students to prioritize those on the students who are lower income. So we subsidize higher education in a number of ways, and if we think that financial barriers are big, then when government gives subsidies to people, I think they should give subsidies to people who, but for the subsidies, would likely not go to college. So prioritizing it on those people that don't have the money to go and that are maybe making their choices based on, having the money. And I think that usually sounds good until you start getting into stuff like tax credits and and subsidies for loans. So we still pay a subsidy on some people have subsidized student loans where your student loans are subsidized while you're in school, and that subsidy kind of goes to a wide variety of people. It's income targeted, but if you go to a very expensive institution, then most people qualify because most people have need, because the institution is really expensive. So that means that students who, we got rid of graduate student subsidies when I was in the Obama administration, partly because we needed more money for Pell Grants. So we had more and more people going to college, and we thought, this is a long answer to your question, but basically there are a lot of ways that we provide different subsidies that are good when you think about them. Give somebody tax credits. Families earning up to $180,000, give them tax credits. Unfortunately, those people are likely to go to college. Not unfortunately, it's great that they're likely to go to college without the tax credit. It makes it easier, it makes it feel less bad, it makes people happier because they have more money in their pockets, but it actually doesn't help anybody else go to college, or it helps some people go to college, but those people would have likely gone to college anyway. And so we should be prioritizing our funding on people that have the most need, and if they didn't have the money, probably wouldn't go. I gave a number of examples, and Lumina doesn't actually lobby on tax credits or hasn't pointed out tax credit or student loan subsidies and said we should get rid of them. But we have been pushing this idea that, another one is merit aid. States have all these merit scholarships. So for Georgia, we have the Hope Scholarship. If you get a B in high school, you go to college, and your tuition is free at any public college in Georgia. That's why my sister went to Georgia Tech, because she was able to get her tuition paid for. That was really inefficient. My sister is an engineer now, and our family made enough money that they could have paid something. But Georgia decided to instead take money from the poor people who pay the lottery to subsidize my sister going to Georgia Tech. So in terms of she would have gone to college anyway, and if she had to take out a loan, it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. So how we decided to subsidize that is not actually, it made our family happy, it made my sister happy. Maybe it caused her to stay in Georgia instead of going to MIT, where she also got in. She doesn't live in Georgia anymore. And most of the research says it's actually not helping people stay in Georgia because ExxonMobil is in Texas and not in Georgia. So when she got a job, she moved where the job was. So anyway, all that to say, a lot of the policies don't really subsidize the people that need the money. They subsidize people for a lot of other reasons, and we think that it should do that. We also are now talking a lot more about cost of living and how non-tuition expenses can impact people's college affordability. You had one up here.
Yeah.
So in response to, microphone, hey.
Yeah.
I don't have to talk as loud now. In response to a question, I think from back there, I don't remember who it was, a long time ago, you mentioned that colleges can charge more because they perceive that families and students can pay more. What do you think how do you think we can prevent things like federal student aid, student loans, from perpetuating perpetuating the increasing costs by making colleges think that people can pay more and therefore just charging more money because, like you mentioned, they can?
So there's a really big, the Bennett hypothesis is Secretary of Education, former Secretary of Education, Bush White House, Bill Bennett, suggested that federal student aid is actually driving up tuition. I think people tended to focus on federal Pell Grants and did a lot of studies around whether Pell Grants actually drove up tuition or not. And most people generally said, not really, maybe on the margins. There's a new study that came out last year that said there's some capture, but it's a small amount, it's not huge. I've seen fewer that focus really on student loans. In general, people think that, and I think I agree, that more people have been able to go to college since 1965-ish, when the student loan system was enacted. I was talking to my grandmother who went to college, which is kind of crazy. It's crazy that a black woman in South Carolina in 1930-something went to college, but she did, and there was no student aid. And she was like, what? When student aid became available, and I was talking to her because she actually ended up in higher education, which is really weird, and she was very disappointed that I ended up doing this until I started working at the White House and had really good jobs, and then she thought that this was okay. But, sorry, Grandma. She was recounting to me kind of before people had student aid to go to college and how that worked. And she was like, oh, wow, it's so great now that you can get loans and stuff. And I think because loans if you could imagine a time before there were loans, college was still fairly expensive. And the reason that there were loans was to help more people afford different types of colleges in particular. So if you didn't want to go to a community college or whatever, now you could get a loan to go somewhere. It's kind of like trying to think about buying a house without a mortgage before. It just would price some people out. So certainly there's probably been some increase that's due to the availability of that. And it's hard to tease that out. There have been some studies that have tried to do that. And again, there's this hypothesis that's there, but there's a lot of controversy about whether that's right. I don't think that's overall right. I think labor-intensive industries tend to increase in price because that's what happens. And just so happens that people that work at colleges make more than people that don't because they're highly educated. And we reward that by continuing to perpetuate the college thing. So college probably would be more expensive regardless, and student loans help people pay that cost. And I think if we didn't have student loans, you probably have fewer people going to college. So there's a trade-off there, and there's some things that come with that, and it's complicated, but I don't think that by and large we should get rid of student aid because it would lower college costs. Although it might, but you probably have fewer people going to college as well. All the way in the back here.
Thanks. So there's obviously a lot of very complicated issues, and no one is going to say somebody at 22 years old having $100K worth of debt is a trivial issue, and there are certainly predatory lending institutions out there. But one of the things I'm just wondering if you can comment on is there's sort of, I think, especially with a lot of the publicity in the media, this idea that college should be free. In fact, there was an article just in our local paper a couple weeks ago from somebody in Norway saying college should be free. And yet, in our society, people will come out of college and plunk down 26 or 30K for a car without ever batting an eye. And do you think we could do a better job of also instilling in people the idea that you're making an investment that'll pay out throughout your whole life, and that it isn't that it should be free, but you should think carefully about that debt and, again, get the best education for it?
Yeah, I think the message about college is definitely nuanced, and so you want to make sure that people are, I know from surveys and stuff that most 8th graders, you go into a class, you ask who wants to go to college, everybody wants to go to college. So we've normalized the idea that you should go to college in this country. It's accepted as a value. Interestingly enough, one of the more interesting surveys that I saw recently was done by the College Board, and I am really bad at remembering if things have become public or not. But in any case, this survey looked at African American parents and how they think about college relative to other people, and they showed that they value education even more than other ethnic groups, which is not kind of surprising, I guess, but it's really interesting because there's sometimes this narrative that they don't value education, they don't care if their kids, but they do, they see it as the way, the future, the light, and so they're willing to push their kids to any college, for-profit college, doesn't matter, go to college. Kind of the same way we push people to like buy houses and stuff, and a house is not the same thing as a college degree. Your college education stays with you forever. But to your question about whether the messaging should be more nuanced, I do think it should be on both sides, both because you could buy something that is not worth it and because people could be scared away from making the investment when they should. So you've got a lot of students in many communities that are debt averse. They're scared to take out debt because they've heard really, really bad stories. When on average, the amount of debt that people are taking out for college degrees is $26,000, very reasonable if you have a bachelor's degree. $26,000 and no bachelor's degree, that is something that we should be concerned about. And by and large, most of the people with a lot of debt actually got graduate degrees. And people with graduate degrees tend to make more. Most of the people with a six-figure debt got really expensive professional degrees, like lawyers and doctors and things like that make a lot of money. In the cases where the small amount of cases where that turns into a bad thing, we've actually got a new program that I'm going to talk about that just because I think people don't know about it. It's called income-based repayment. So you can base your payment on the amount of percentage of income that you make, like 10% or 15% of your income, so that at least provides some insurance against if you end up in a low-paying job. So if you're a lawyer, you took out a lot of debt, you become a public defender, you'd only have to pay 10% of your income to service your student loan. So I think the messaging should definitely be more nuanced. There's a lot of stuff about free college lately. It tends not to focus on the cost of living issues that are actually causing people to take out debt. Community colleges in California are basically free, yet students still need to take out debt. Why? Because they can't pay for their cars and can't pay for childcare and things like that. But yes, I think it should be more nuanced. The only reason I don't totally discount the free college thing is because it's extremely powerful as a message. So again, I'm from Georgia, where we wasted a lot of money on people who could otherwise go to college. But the interesting thing about when people study the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program, which is making tuition fee for people that make at least a B in high school, is that it actually had the impact of, or it seems like it had the impact of increasing college going in Georgia. And so more people, including more people from lower income families, resonated with that message of it's free. And even if that low income family would have gotten a Pell Grant and would have been able to go for free anyway, even if they would have gotten some state aid, the message of simplicity is much, the high level of kind of discounting that we do, where we say, oh, we know the tuition says $60,000, but if your family is low income, no, we're going to have scholarships for you. That is really difficult to get down to the kind of people that don't have those networks. And so I agree. I think, it makes sense that people should pay something. And if you ask me, I always do this kind of exercise, like if say there was no labor market return to higher education. It was just, you came to places, you heard interesting talks, you got to talk with other people who, were similarly kind of situated, similarly interested in different topics. And you got to learn from really interesting people. Maybe you even got to stay at like a resort-like place, and there was a spa, there was stuff there, How much would you pay for that? And you would pay something for that. You wouldn't expect it to be free. So even if there was no labor market return, like if you just told me tomorrow that I could come up here, maybe Dartmouth wanted to start a program and I could just enroll and I, wouldn't necessarily get anything out of it, but I don't know if you have nice spa-like, campus environments. But Vanderbilt they had a nail salon in one of my dorms when I was there. I mean, you got the nail salon there, you've got the laundry service, you got the, you've got, unlimited dining options from an executive chef, and you got interesting people to talk to me all day. I'd pay something for that. I might pay a couple $1,000s for that. Probably wouldn't pay $60,000, but I'd pay something. And so the idea that it necessarily should be free, I think, goes against that. And somebody should tell me how much time I have, but here, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the higher education and the push for change there. I'm wondering what about lower level education, like elementary schools and stuff like that? What is being pushed in those areas?
A lot is being talked about with K-12 education policy is probably the biggest hot topic right now. Concern there is largely like achievement gap issues, so whether some students are doing better than others based on their background or whatever. the changes are really contentious. There's kind of push for charter schools, push for more students to have different options, school choice. So if your neighborhood school is not that great, if it looks like the teachers aren't that great or whatever, you could go somewhere else. I think one of the biggest things that's been going on since No Child Left Behind, and even since before No Child Left Behind, is this idea of standards-based reform. So very, very, very quickly, for a long time, we were concerned about graduation rates. We were concerned about students not graduating from high school. And so we asked states to kind of, as part of No Child Left Behind even, to have certain graduation rates targets and certain targets for their test scores. So we said, or not test scores, but we wanted students to be passing these tests that their states had. My state had the Georgia high school graduation test, and we asked them to increase their pass rates on these tests because we were concerned that enough students aren't passing the test. But then we said we would take the federal money away if students didn't pass the test or if you didn't get these graduation rate goals. So because the states also controlled the test and the test cut scores, the best way to get more people to pass a test when you're in a tight crunch is to lower the cut score or to make the test easier. So we had what Arnie Duncan liked to call a race to the bottom of who could have the easiest possible test so that you can make sure the students pass because you did not want to lose your federal money by the time it came. So now we've kind of got this renewed push for higher standards in K-12 schools. Along with the race to the bottom, a lot of colleges would say, hey, students are showing up here, they got their high school diploma, they passed their high school graduation test, and they are totally not college ready. Like they can't even read and write, and we don't know how this happened. And it happened because they were doing a race to the bottom because they didn't want it to look like they weren't meeting their standards. So there's now a renewed push. That's what the Common Core is supposed to be about. If you ever wonder why did we have the Common Core, or what was that? It was supposed to be to get states away from kind of doing their own thing. The tagline was algebra in Massachusetts shouldn't be different than algebra in Mississippi, and that all states should have commonly high standards. As with any policy, the implementation has been interesting, and the ways that they've actually integrated that into the curriculum and into the assessments has been interesting. So that's probably, I think, the biggest issue in K-12 education right now is that stuff. Am I out of time? Or a few more? Okay, sure.
So why would you not expect the same thing to happen in higher education if you instituted a policy of tying graduation rates to funding?
I think that is a concern. I think that is absolutely probably one of the biggest concerns about completion, which is why Lumina is also really interested in quality right now. I don't have the answer of how because higher ed is just different than K-12. It is not compulsory, it's not mandatory, and we're really averse to federal control in higher education, which I think is probably a good thing. I think it's different than K-12, and people can be really averse to federal control in K-12 education for that matter. But I do think that if you had a policy for tying graduation numbers, getting more people to graduate to funding, which we've been pushing for in a number of states, you could have people lower the standards. In some ways, some of the responses are, could be positive, not lowering the standards, but making it easier for people. So making it easier for people to transfer, kind of looking at your degree, requirements and saying, do we still need to have everybody take a swimming class, or is that like kind of antiquated, and is that an unnecessary burden? I mean, there's still places that have stuff like that. So, no, you don't. I do not know how to swim, and so I could have never come here. That's crazy. Maybe. Yes. Wow. Okay. But something like that. I mean, maybe if we took away swimming here, more people would graduate. You already have a really, really high graduation rate. But also maybe that you would see that as totally antithetical to the Dartmouth experience, and that's totally undermine the quality of the degree. So I don't know. It's hard to know whether those things make a difference. But I take the point, and I think that we have to be simultaneously thinking about how we ensure quality, because we otherwise will have a bunch of people with worthless degrees. Okay. Yes.
It seems that this discussion about, I think, quality, of course, is important, accessibility, and then, of course, the support for funding graduation rates as opposed to enrollment. But the immediate impact, you talked about earlier, you kind of mentioned, kind of off-putting, mentioned that there are some kind of implications. And those implications are really that the schools that have done the most for educating low-income students have been disproportionately hurt by this shift. So for example, when you shift, historically black colleges are the leading producers of African Americans in every form of education in every measure. So PhDs in science, pharmacy, medicine, law. If we look, 60% of the white collar force in America, African Americans, are products of historically black colleges. Yet when we switch to grad, they also have notoriously low graduation rates. Now, some of those things should be addressed, but at the same time, they also take on, at Florida A&M takes on students that the University of Florida would never touch. So they're also providing opportunities. Now, I think there's some questions about debt and affordability, et cetera, but on average, it's much cheaper to go to the Alabama A&M than it is to go to the University of Alabama in-state. So is it this push for supporting graduation rates and funding, states funding graduation, is the immediate impact going to be basically you cut out low-income students in the first place?
I'm so glad you asked that question, and I think this is why it's important not to focus on graduation rates. So when you focus on graduation rates, the easiest way to gain your graduation rate is to take in fewer students and students who are more likely to graduate. If you focus on numbers of graduates, which I think we try to so one, you should focus on, are you actually increasing the numbers of graduates? So that's the first thing. The second thing is to disaggregate by those things that you're talking about. So if you as a state like Tennessee, and I think the first time Tennessee did this, they didn't get it quite right, and they're now reforming the system. But you should be rewarding people more if they take on the hardest to serve students. So in the ways that we're now working with states, we're asking them, if you're Tennessee, maybe you should be thinking about the places that have more Pell Grant recipients and giving them more funding than you actually do now. Get more funding if you graduate a Pell Grant student than if you do a student that's not Pell eligible. So it's numbers of graduates, it's kind of looking at the, I don't want to say difficulty of educating, but kind of how much are you actually reaching out to increase equity in how you're doing school. And you're also looking at missions of school. So do you have a more open access mission? Are you trying to reach out? Do you have more minority students at your college? Is that one of the goals that we have for you? If so, then you get more funding. So I think there are ways to include outcome measures that are consistent with our values. But I'm very glad that you asked that, because you have to have those values in the first place.
But then that also requires you to trust the states to actually do some of that, right?
Well, yeah, I think the whole thing with trusting states in general is to create their own measures has a set of issues that are historical. I don't know, there's conversations about a federal system, but it doesn't sound like those conversations right now include a state go-between. President Obama has a proposal to create a rating system where they would rate colleges on affordability, access, whatever. And all of the people that I've heard have said that they want actually to account for these things. They want to account for institutional mission. They want to reward institutions actually for taking on students that are needier. I think the way in which you do that is difficult, because it's like, what kind of data do we have to do that? But I think there's a skepticism about whether they actually will do that. And there's a concern that it just won't happen because in other states it hasn't happened. But the people, I know people on the inside, and I know that they are actually concerned about that very thing. And their desire is not to reward the University of Alabama over Alabama A&M if Alabama A&M is doing a better job by its African American students. The desire is to find the places where it's happening.
But then it doesn't, some of that money is filtered through the state. So like, for example, in Florida, you get a state budget.
Oh yeah, the states have their own budgets that are happening.
$1 million out of the budget of Florida A&M, that's a crisis.
Yeah.
Versus the University of Florida, which won't miss $1 million when they can make that up on a Saturday afternoon in a football game.
Yeah, so that's I think that may be happening in states, and right now, the federal system isn't being filtered through states. That's just how state appropriations, that's just how state colleges are funded. The work Lumina is doing is encouraging states to be more nuanced in how they do it. Lumina has no accountability measure to states. We're giving them technical assistance, and we're suggesting that they be concerned about these things when they design their funding allocation systems. But I think that point is well taken, that they should be concerned about those pieces. The only thing that I would say is that if you actually design it with the right criteria in mind, it is possible to reward the right people. You have to design it with the right criteria in mind. And so, as we know, state legislatures don't always do that. One more? Okay, right here. You asked one.
So, in passing, you mentioned the University of Phoenix, and then I got curious. So, for-profit colleges like that, where the goal isn't necessarily always just to turn out students who can do well in the job market, what role do you think they play in the new college landscape? Do you think they're a good thing, or do you think that there's something that might need to be toned down as we go forward?
I'm definitely more on the side that we need to be thinking more about their outcomes. If you're interested more in for-profit colleges and regulations around them, there's a current regulatory regime called gainful employment that the Obama administration started while I was there. The idea is that for colleges, it applies to all colleges that have, it's programs, it actually doesn't apply to colleges, it applies to programs, but programs that do not lead to a degree, so certificate programs, at nonprofits and publics, as well as basically all programs at for-profits. So there's a difference in how it's applied, but all programs at for-profits, because they're this is very technical, but they're in a different part of the Higher Education Act. So when they're authorized to operate under the Higher Education Act, they were authorized to provide programs leading to gainful employment, gainful employment in a recognized occupation. So this idea was to actually define what gainful employment is, because the concern was that there were a lot of students that were either graduating or not graduating, but going to these colleges that were not finding employment in a recognized occupation, and that therefore they weren't living up to what they were authorized to do. So we define that using a debt-to-income metric and a repayment rate, and saying if you did not have students that had at least this debt-to-income ratio, so where debt to income would be a lower ratio would be a good thing. You know, you shouldn't have a high debt to income ratio. And where a repayment rate, where a higher metric would be a good thing. So we set the floor repayment rate, I think, at 35%. If at least 35% of the loan dollars were being repaid, that would be a good floor. We got sued by the For-Profit College Lobby Association, and we lost the lawsuit in part because the judge said that the way we justified the measure was not sound enough. And so they are now in the process of re-regulating with hopefully better justification for the measures. But the judge did say that the department had the authority to regulate in this area. So I guess I say all that to say, I think that there were some really aggressive recruiting practices. So if you ever for fun, I don't know how it is now, but we used to do this for fun in the office. We would go online, and if you're like me, and whatever I put in my Gmail, like how Gmail searches your email and has like ads that are corresponding, whatever I put in there puts up stuff, probably because I'm a nerd, things on the side that say, do you want an Obama loan, or like things like that. And so if you click on that and you fill out the stuff, you start getting calls pretty quickly from recruiters, and just kind of go through the rigmarole of talking to them and like seeing what happens. But it's really interesting, that side of like college, because that is what a lot of adults and people that are not your traditional college student are facing. If you don't have the infrastructure of a college counselor, or even a college access program, or a church program, or somebody that's like helping you navigate. We had meetings with Google, and they said, you know how many people just type into the search bar, where should I go to college? You would be shocked. And they're looking for help. They're looking for help and advice and counseling, because they never had it before, and we don't really have great systems for providing that for people. So I think and then you get these like kind of aggressive marketing campaigns where it's like it's just a high pressure, it's like a high pressure sales campaign. I don't know if you've ever been in a high pressure sales situation, but they're trained to kind of figure out what makes you tick. So if you come in and you tell me, hey, what's your name? What's important to you? You say, well, my kids are important to me. They say, well, you really want to go to college for your kids, right? You're not going to and if you try to leave, you're going to let your kids down? You're going to leave here without signing this thing? You're going to let your kids down? You're going to be a failure just like your dad who never went to college? I mean, this is what was in the guidelines for not all, but some of these places to what to say. There was some of the worst ones were saying, you should find out if they've had a recent death in the family and really talk about that as a reason to, just kind of really icky stuff. So hopefully some of these regulations will, curb some of the worst abuses. There were some folks that were preying on not brain dead, but brain damaged veterans, because veterans come with GI Bill money. So anyway, there's just a lot of kind of interesting things in this. If you're looking for a research topic or something, there's a lot of interesting stuff in that place. And I don't think they're all bad, though. I think there is a place for that in society. I think that there are they've done a lot to Talk about reaching out to low-income people. They're able to find the low-income students at the for-profit colleges. They are not some mythical student for the for-profit colleges. They have found them because 90% of them are on Pell Grants at these colleges. So there's a lot to be said for they don't have problems filling out the FAFSA at for-profit colleges. That, for whatever reason, is not a burden. So there is something to learn there about how to overcome those barriers for students that don't come from college-going families. I mean. There's also some good training programs, and not all of them don't lead to anything. But I think there are a lot of abuses that have been going on, and hopefully there'll be less of them in the future. Thank you, guys. Thank you. These are really great questions. Thank you.